This is a story of my mother, Guna. She told me a number of stories, and I wish I'd recorded them. But I do remember a few that she told me, and I will share with them in this presentation. One of the stories she told me was about her grandfather, Gopal Sami. He was a soldier in the army. He distinguished himself by rescuing a princess from the clutches of men, preserving her dignity and her life, and he was able to return her to her father. Her father, being so impressed with him, wanted to give his daughter in marriage to her grandfather. But he reminded the princess's father that they were of different castes and that it would not be appropriate for his daughter to marry him. So the man thanked him, and my grandfather returned to his home. My mother's father, Bhagwati, was a person who worked in the dye industries, and he really excelled and was very skillful in it and rose to very high positions. He and his wife gave birth to a son who was killed, and after that my aunt Devaki and Savitri were born, and my mother was the fourth child. After that, another child was born, and my grandmother died in childbirth, and my mother would not have a mother for the rest of her life, and she would have to go and live with her maternal grandparents, whereas my two aunts went and lived with their father and traveled with him to all the places where he worked. My grandfather married again and had two daughters, Kanta, Neela, and a son, Gangadhar. And soon after they were born, their mother died. So we'd end up marrying for the third time and had two sons, Jagdish and Ghanshyam. Their mother also died, and so he married for the fourth and last time and had two daughters and a son, Veena, Nirmala, and Jitendra. My mother had known sorrow very early in her life by losing her mother, and she would face such moments again in her life, and I will share other stories about that. My mother and father came from two different backgrounds. My mother came from a very wealthy home. She lived in a metropolitan city, and my father came from a small little village in a different state. And when they married, my father thought that my mother must be as educated as her sisters who went to college, and my mother thought that my dad would be the best choice for her because he came from a small village. He was a humble man, but he was one of the most educated men in his village, and my mother, who had been raised by her grandparents, was not allowed to go to school after a few years because they saw that her sisters who went to school had become very independent, and so they kept her at home in spite of her teachers pleading for her to return because she was such a smart student. But my mother learned very early on that she had very little control over her life. So they got her married off. Although she was the youngest, she got married first, and she started her life. My father had no idea that my mother was not educated, so he was in for a rude awakening because this was an arranged marriage, as most marriages in India are. My mother would end up having a number of children, and so she was always cooking in the kitchen. I remember seeing her in the kitchen all the time. We had so many relatives that would come to visit us, and she enjoyed cooking. She had to cook for a household of 9 all the time, and then she cooked for relatives who were visiting. I have no idea how she did that, and she never complained. My mother loved relatives, loved her children and her grandchildren. She loved animals. She had a pet chicken. I heard used to even sit on her head and lie around my mom all the time. She loved family times, and she would make great sacrifices to travel to the United States for special occasions in my life and to spend time with her extended families. There were rare moments when all